It's the week ending Friday the 4th of July, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the government gutting their welfare reform bill in the 11th hour to stave off a backbench revolt, large parts of Europe sweltering under a heat dome, and the death in a car crash of Portuguese international and Liverpool player Diogo Jota, aged 28. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And as ever, I'm joined from the week's digital team by Jamie Timson and Harriet Marsden and senior editor of The Week Junior, Felicity Capon. And guys, this week, M&S launched the strawberry and cream sandwich. It's already big in Japan. Will any of you be standing in line?
Absolutely not.
No.
Can't think of anything more disgusting.
It sounds awful.
If there's an example of the decay of British society,
It's the strawberry and cream sandwich from Marks & Spencer. I'm sure that's what they wanted their press release to achieve. Felicity, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Should being on a wall footing mean being on an equal footing?
In the world situation we're in right now, it's necessary to have more conscripts, and I think that women should contribute to that equally as men do. So actually I think it's a positive change, but I do think that a lot of women as well as men that might be forced to get into the military, it hasn't been like that in many years. I think it'll be a change.
Katrina, a volunteer in the Danish army, speaking to Reuters on Monday. What's the story, Felicity?
The story is that Denmark is set to make military service compulsory for its women for the first time. So as of Tuesday this week, women over the age of 18 will be entered into a gender-neutral lottery, which could see them drafted into the army if their number comes up. Okay,
so the current situation is that they have a volunteer military, don't they? So young people can volunteer of any gender. But then when it comes to conscription, when they try and make up the gap of people who haven't volunteered, at the moment that's only men who can be conscripted, and they're changing that.
That's right. So under Danish law, all physically fit men over the age of 18 are called up for military service, and there's usually enough volunteers to fill all the slots, so the draft isn't used that often. But now there is a push to increase the capacity of the Danish army so that both women and men could now potentially be drafted, and lots of senior military figures and government figures want to do this because of the fear of Russian aggression. They're looking over at Ukraine. Denmark and Russia don't actually share a border, but they're still very worried about their Russian neighbour, and that's why they are doing this.
Okay, so on the issue of gender equality, though, Harriet, I mean, it is equal, isn't it? It is only fair if you're going to force men to be in the military, then you should be forcing women as well. It's presumably not just combat roles.
So this is actually quite a rare story in which I think there are incredibly compelling arguments on both sides, and I have no idea which side I come down on. The thing is, obviously the argument is that with equal rights between the genders and sexes comes equal responsibilities, and also there are a lot of people who argue that there are certain roles and situations in which women could actually be more effective than men. So, for example, in any kind of negotiation situation or espionage, there is some evidence to suggest that women can be more effective in those roles. So you're widening your skill set. But the problem is that the military as a system is designed for men, in the same way that body armor is designed for male bodies, in the same way that combat roles are designed to suit male physicality and capabilities, and the standards of physical fitness have been designed for men. So you can't shoehorn women into a system necessarily that's designed for men and call it equality. Female prisoners of war, for example, would be disproportionately more at risk of rape or torture. As well, we've seen so many cases of female army members being subject to sexual harassment and assault within their own units. So there are really, really good arguments for and against the issue for female conscription, but there aren't that many countries that do it.
What other countries do it, Jamie?
So Denmark is now the third European country to apply conscription equally to men and women. Norway and Sweden are the other two. Countries such as Austria, Finland, Greece and Cyprus conscript men only. Women may volunteer. The Netherlands has gender-neutral conscription in law but hasn't enforced it in peacetime since 1997. Around the world, it's quite interesting. China, Eritrea, North Korea, Taiwan, and some African nations like Mozambique as well as Eritrea have women conscription. I think the interesting angle on it is that obviously this is about compulsory forcing people into conscription into the army, and if you are saying that you have to sign up, there is a onus on the government to make the experience as fair as possible. And as Harriet was touching on, I think the figure is that at the moment somewhere within the EU it's 10% of the armed forces are women, and in that situation it doesn't feel like the government or the armed forces are really creating an equal setting, because there's only 10% of women. It's a 90-10 split. It does suggest to me that there maybe needs to be more done in terms of making it easier for women to join.
How popular is this policy, Felicity, in Denmark? Is it well supported?
I think it's a mixed bag. I think there are a lot of people who think that the threat from Russia does merit increased mobilization. And I think over the last few years, you have seen more campaigns for equality across the board. And if we want equality and female representation in X, Y, and Z, then surely that has to extend to the military as well. There was a poll in 2011 that said that 2/3 of Danes wanted conscription to be abolished. Presumably that's much higher among the younger generation, but I suppose that could have changed since 2011, that, circumstances are different now. I do think worldwide there's a very interesting trend that men are starting to say, as Harriet was alluding to, actually, if we have to fight, surely women do too. If you want greater rights, you also have to bear the responsibilities. And the US is a very interesting case. So in 2021, the US Supreme Court declined to hear a challenge by a men's rights group to the national requirement that men but not women register for the military draft at age 18. So not many people know that, but the draft does actually still exist in the US. In fact, a lot of Americans don't know that it still exists. You have to, when you turn 18, you have to register with the selective service system within 30 days of your 18th birthday in case conscription is brought back, but that doesn't apply to women. And so that there has been high profile challenges to the Supreme Court from the country's men saying, this isn't fair. And the same is the case in South Korea as well. South Korea being a very interesting example, because obviously it has the threat of North Korea right on its border, and it has a declining population. So they're in a right pickle. So they're in a...
Are you laughing because they like kimchi in Korea? Is that what the nature of this laugh is?
It just wasn't the right phrase. But South Korea, so South Korea does have conscription for men, but there is a lot of unrest between the sexes, and men sort of say, well, women, you've got to serve as well, which is, an interesting point. But it's more about, for me, it's like, yes, we want equality, and I'm sort of the same with Harriet. I can see good reasons why women should fight, but this shouldn't be it shouldn't be if I'm going in to fight, you have to fight too. I think it's what's going to make the most effective army. Who is your enemy? What is the nature of the war? Are women going to help, or are they going to hinder?
I do think it's interesting that this is where certain men's rights groups choose to start arguing for equality. Like, obviously, the men's rights group that brought the case to, I think it was in 2019, a Texas federal judge heard this case challenging the male-only military registration in the US. And the Texas federal judge ruled that it was unconstitutional. But at no point were those same men's rights groups kind of advocating for equal pay in military roles, equal representation, special protections for women from sexual assault and harassment in the military. So all other areas in which it would be considered to be extraordinarily unequal between the sexes. And ditto South Korea as well, which has one of the worst gender pay gaps in the developed world.
I also think we've kind of not really gone into it so much, but to bring it back to the UK, there's been so many inquests and inquiries into the experiences of service women in the UK Army. 19-year-old soldier Jaisley Beck took her own life in December 2021, and the inquest into her death found that she was sexually assaulted and then failed by the army. And one of the key issues with that, while also showing how awful situation sometimes women find themselves in the army, being unable to report sexual offences. But the key thing is that a lot of the time they go to military police rather than civilian police for these issues, and the military police have a kind of a history of not really being able to see through some of the claims, and certainly not modern in the same way that maybe the civilian police does. And I know that's something that within the UK government are looking to maybe change.
Those countries that you mentioned earlier, Jamie, China, Taiwan, talked about Israel, Korea. I mean, those are countries where we understand what the risks are, and we understand that, frankly, they're either in a war or on the brink of having a war. That is not necessarily how the population feel in Europe, but look at Scandinavia, and obviously that is the influence of what's been happening in Ukraine. We've seen this increase in defence spending commitments. Do you think this is the next thing that could roll westwards? More conscription?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think about the amount of time that we've been doing this podcast for since we've started back in 2017, and we always talked about the kind of potential for a world war and the need for greater levels of military involvement and where the British Army it kind of stands. I think it's mad now to look back and realise quite how close we are to some sort of conflict in Europe. But there is a massive concern now that, whatever happens in Ukraine might lead to a bigger war in Europe. And as countries in Europe, we do need to have a think about war readiness. And you can see that with the arguments about, international aid and where the money is going to come from to pay for this defence. I think it's not until we get to that situation and we have to start asking questions about, who is conscripted, what the standard of readiness for the army is. Obviously, we don't know what that will look like when the day comes, but we're much closer to it than I think I ever thought we would be.
And we're seeing a scale up of commitment, aren't we, Felicity, in this country as well?
Well, not really amongst younger people. That was the point I was going to make. I think when it comes to this country, the fear is that you might need to introduce conscription because there's been such a dismantling of any patriotic or nationalistic feeling, any fervour or desire to go and fight for your country. There was a Times survey earlier this year that said only 11% of the people they'd surveyed would definitely fight for Britain, while 41%, whatever the cause, would not fight. And part of that survey, a lot of young people were saying they were actually embarrassed to say they were British. I think that raises all sorts of concerns. You have to also think about the conditions of the military, housing, how we look after our vets, the pay that's on offer. It's not an attractive career prospect for many people who already don't really see why they should have to put their life on the line for this country.
But isn't that it? Isn't that the framing over my whole lifetime has been that the army is a career, not a duty? It's all been search army jobs, be the best, go out, meet some friends. If you're not that kind of person, it doesn't appeal to you. You wouldn't think, oh, but I should join because that's my duty as a Brit. I mean, it's just not been positioned that way.
No, but I think there needs to be more as a social contract anyway. If I'm going to go off and put my life on the line, I need to be proud of this country. This country needs to have been a place where I could buy a house and start a family and get a job and succeed and thrive. And then, yes, I'd go off and defend my country. But young people don't feel that way. I mean, there's also concerns about, with conscription, whether young people are physically and mentally fit enough to fight in the army. That's the thing. It's not that your number gets up and you're drafted in. You do actually have to make sure that you're, in relatively good shape to go off and fight. But I think the idea of what a war would look like is also really interesting, because presumably we've gone past the point where this is troops on the front line fighting in trenches against, let's say Russia. Hasn't warfare moved on to drones? We've talked about AI in previous episodes. Is it that we need more manpower, or do we need more drones? Do we need more robots to fill our armies?
I mean, Ukraine has both, doesn't it? I mean, it does have trenches. It does have men standing there in the rotting cold firing guns at each other.
Yes, and there's been lots of casualties on both sides. But when you look at the sheer numbers involved, the numbers of Russian soldiers compared to the Danish army, I mean, Russian army just dwarfs everyone. So I'm not actually sure that if it's a battle of, numbers versus numbers. Yeah,
I mean, at the last election, Harriet, there was a lot of kind of open derision at Rishi Sunak's concept of national service, wasn't there? But as much as anything, I feel like that came from a place of people feeling the Conservatives were flailing around to say something that would appeal to the Daily Mail and they didn't really mean it. But, you know, as a policy in the cold light of day, regardless of which political party suggested it, that sort of thing is the kind of thing that might be needed to address some of the concerns Felicity's raising, isn't it?
Well, we did talk about that suggestion at the time, remember, on this podcast, and we talked quite in depth about how much of a kind of a not serious suggestion it really was. It was much more of a political bait than anything else, to be honest with you. But in terms of what war looks like now and whether or not some sort of national service or forced conscription would actually be of any benefit, yes, on the one hand, the British Army is dramatically lacking in numbers. I think it's expected to dip below 70,000 this year, which is the smallest it's been since the Napoleonic era, which is wild to think about. There's also an argument that there are a lot of very senior people, including like former members of MI6 and former defense ministers, saying that we are actually already at war with Russia. War does not look like what people think it looks like. And in that sense, and in the fact that the vast majority of casualties in the Ukraine-Russia war have been caused by drones, so I think that the idea of national service is much more of a sort of kind of nod to a certain type of patriotism, a kind of attempt at jingoistic involvement than an actual serious defense strategy in the realities of modern warfare.
I read a great piece in Time, actually, that really changed my mind on the draft, that basically argue that bringing back the draft or reinstating the draft in America, combined with a war tax, could actually stop America's forever wars. Because if everyone has to serve, including the children of the rich and the powerful, would you have more of a public conversation and more engagement about whether, you know, these wars that have been raged for years in Iraq and Afghanistan, you know, should be going on, which I thought was so interesting, that maybe the draft is actually a really good thing because it will force us all to engage more with wars and who should be fighting them and when.
Okay. Up next, let's get digital, our ID cards back. That's after this. Okay, Jamie, it's your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week, we called App Britain.
We cannot continue with business as usual, and change is inevitable. This is where technology, like digital ID, becomes critical. My institute's own analysis shows that introducing this in the UK would save at least $2 billion a year, and likely more, by reducing losses to fraud, improving tax collection, and better targeting of state support.
Former PM Tony Blair back in April on the YouTube channel for his Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Jamie, what's the story?
This week, the UK government released a new mobile app. I presume you've already downloaded it, Ollie.
You know I'm an early adopter, Jamie, always.
Yeah, sometimes you're downloading apps in your sleep, aren't you? The new government app, so it launched this week. The idea is, it basically hasn't got a lot to it, but the idea is that it's a kind of one-stop shop where you can go on the app and you'll be able to find out all the kind of stuff that you need to know about the government services. At the moment, it's just a series of links to gov.uk pages, but Peter Kyle, who's the Science, Innovation and Technology Secretary of State, he's promised very rapid progress with the app. What's going to come is there's going to be a chatbot, an AI chatbot that's going to help you with all of your government needs. But most importantly, digital driving licenses are going to be available by the end of this year. The discussion over digital driving licenses leads on to what we heard just then from Tony Blair and the return of the debate over ID and ID cards and
it's
digital
fascinating,
IDs.
isn't it? Because you sort of get the sense that, I mean, considering how much that new Labour government actually did, you know, achieve that transformed the way Britain is, it really feels like ID cards is the one that got away for Tony Blair.
Yeah.
Every time he talks on this issue, I think there's a feeling in his generation of Labour politicians that was the thing, that it was a good idea, but they couldn't make it work, and they're still banging the drum for it. And you think this might be digital ID by the back door?
What's interesting is kind of the reasons that it never happened. Actually, it's a policy that is fairly popular with the kind of median British person. There was a YouGov study that came out that said it was like 6 in 10 said that they would back ID cards. The kind of reason that it failed was this kind of British notion that you know, that papers please ideology is not for us, and you know, we fought fascism so we wouldn't have to have a little ID card in our wallet. But actually, I think that broadly the consensus was there from the British public. What actually happened was that for a variety of reasons, the politicians, particularly those that were kind of maybe New Labour but not Blairite, kind of saw it as something that they didn't need to take forward, and we've never really got there yet. But this is I'm bringing it to the table. This is why I've brought it today, is that I think we are probably on the cusp, maybe, of a national ID, a digital ID.
Well, regardless, Harriet, of whether this mooted digital ID card, I think they call it brick card or something, don't they, as a policy idea, ends up being incorporated into this gov.uk wallet, which is going to be part of this app or not, if that is where your driving licence sits, then we know the direction of travel, don't we? Because it happens with everything else. It happened with the TV licence, for example. That'll be where your driving licence is. So therefore, that is a digital ID, regardless of whether the brick card thing ends up in there, because most people have a driving licence.
Well, I guess that there is an argument that this is sort of a rebranding of what already exists. Like, for example, e-visas for all foreign residents and the gov.uk wallet. They do the same sort of thing. We've got the NHS app as well that was brought in during COVID. There are all sorts of ways in which this is the direction of travel. And what's, I think, interesting is that YouGov survey that Jamie was talking about public sentiment around digital IDs, is that actually when you dig into the weeds of it, about 40% of respondents said that they thought that the government could misuse a digital ID, and only 23% thought that it could actually be of any benefit to the legitimate economy. So there are nuances when we talk about public opinion around digital ID. I think it's really fair to say that it depends on the question that people are asked. In terms of what the direction of travel, I think it's really interesting to look at Ukraine, which was the first country in the world where smartphone passports were legally equivalent to the paper document. And it's fascinating because even before the war broke out, it was already an extremely tech-savvy nation. And then in 2019, they launched this app, this so-called everything app, before Elon Musk decided to start using that phrase, called Dia, through which you can use, it's now used by 22 million people. And you can access more than 70 government services, store your digital documents, your ID. You can file claims about your homes that are damaged during the war, compensation claims, open bank accounts. There's all sorts of incredible benefits to it. And it has been an extraordinary success. But in terms of the UK, there is, I think, very legitimate concerns around how much the government in general and the Home Office in particular can be trusted with people's data and people's IDs, and there's concerns over privacy and security and fraud and disenfranchisement of people who wouldn't have access to it anyway.
But it's also been heralded as a big thing in tackling immigration, right? And I think that explains why people in this country are generally quite enthusiastic about it, because we have this problem of immigration which successive governments have been completely unable to do anything about, and it just seems like it's just no one's ever going to be able to fix this problem. And all of a sudden,
do we have a problem? I mean, it's of net benefit to the economy.
I think it does way more harm than good. But on the issue of these cards, it seems very seductive and appealing that these cards are going to come along, and automatically that's going to sort of tell us where illegal immigrants are and sort of like enable us to get the numbers down to where we want them to be. And that does seem appealing, but I just don't see how it could possibly work. I mean, I think it just seems fraught with difficulty. It's extremely expensive, and also I don't think sort of locating immigrants has ever been the problem. It's that we don't see, I mean, they're basically all in hotels that taxpayers are paying for. I think the problem has been being able to remove them and keep the numbers down or stop them coming in the first place. So it seems weird that Labour are using this as, you know, we could finally sort out this issue that has been dogging the country for so long. But I'd be extremely surprised if it was a panacea that was going to, you know, solve all of Britain's issues overnight.
It's interesting, isn't it, Jamie? Because in the 90s, that first time round, I remember that debate. Part of the concern was if the police can sort of stop and ask to see your documents, you probably won't get asked if you are a white man in your 30s or 40s. But think about other ethnic groups and minorities, and they're more likely to be pursued, sort of stop and search type argument. But as Felicity's suggesting, in a way, weirdly now, part of the pro argument is that this could be used to pursue people who otherwise elude searches, because it's a straightforward question. Do you have the documents or not? Everyone carries them around with them. If you don't, that's an issue. That's why we've stopped you.
Yeah, I mean, it's about access to services, right? You know, like one of the big worries about immigration and people coming in is strain on resources and strain on access to services. And if you've come here illegally, you don't have access to resources, and the way that you go and actively use these services could be linked to your ID card. So you could be stopped from accessing services because you don't have the correct ID. I read a really interesting piece in The Critic actually about this that I would recommend everyone go and read, about why we don't need ID cards. And actually the problem is that we just genuinely don't know how many people are in the UK currently. And a lot of the ways in which we have surveyed to work out what our population is are just massively faulty. We know that the ONS has massive problems in terms of the way that it creates data. And so potentially the ID card is slightly shutting the gate after the horse has bolted, to use another slightly odd phrase.
Well, also in terms of actually the way technology is developed. I mean, that's the other thing we haven't quite discussed yet. We sort of hinted at it. But, you know, in the years since the original ID card proposal, most people are on social media, whether they choose to or not, because other people tag them in photos. There's facial recognition. There's Ring doorbells on most doorsteps. We're constantly under surveillance. Commercial companies know where we are, and people have volunteered their data in exchange for, you know, slightly slicker emails. So, I mean, what difference does it make if the government does it too?
That's the main argument, is that it's better to have it all under one government database than have it sporadically owned by Meta or whoever. I think that the thing about it being too expensive, I mean, if it solves a problem, it's worth the money, right? And countries like Estonia have been using it, and it's worked very well. Harriet mentioned Ukraine. There are countries around the world that have spent the money to be able to make it happen. It's whether or not you believe that India it fixes a problem.
You know, and that's not a country, I know that they're, you know, technologically quite advanced, but that, you know, you talk about a country where you're not sure how many people are in it. You'd think India would be a great example of that, and yet they've managed to do it.
I mean, I definitely think there are pros when you look at the Estonia example. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but utility bills are the bane of my life. Having to be asked for a utility bill to, like, you know, prove something, and you just never have one to hand. And apparently in Estonia, sounds like a boast, but they tax returns, you can do it in 3 minutes. Their card, it's called the EID, and it's estimated to save them 5 days a year of dealing with bureaucracy, which sounds great. I wonder if more people will vote, because, you know, I think Estonians can vote just by using this card, just do it on their phone. They don't have to go to a polling station. So I can see that there are all these upsides. Convenience is very attractive, obviously, but it always comes back to at what cost? At what cost does this convenience come? Is it the cost of our civil liberties? Is it the cost of our privacy? And it's worth thinking what the worst case scenario is. You know, what's the dystopian nightmare that's lurking around the corner? Like right now, it's this government in power controlling this app. But what happens in the future? It's another government, a dodgy government that gets into power that can shut off all our access to stuff. Because, you know, with this, you really are putting all your eggs into one basket, all your information, all your data, all in one place. What happens if you suddenly can't access that? And you know, I saw a good comment piece from someone. If you suddenly have to go through the courts to try and get it all remedied, do we really trust the systems that we have in place in government to remedy this? Are the courts up to it? Are the authorities up to it? And I don't think they are.
Well, whether you think this would be dystopian or not, according to the polling, we've got a chance of having a Reform UK government next time round. And what's clear is their attitude to all this kind of stuff would be very different, wouldn't it?
I think that's largely driven this resurgence of this, which was an extraordinarily controversial policy of Tony Blair's. It's this kind of vague appeal to a certain type of nationalism in some kind of half-baked attempt to head off the threat of reform while the Labour government looks as shaky as it does. based on this promise of convenience that actually doesn't stand up to scrutiny at all. Like, it's all well and good using the examples of Estonia or Ukraine, two extraordinarily digitally savvy nations, or Meta, a massive, massive tech company, is not synonymous with the Home Office. It's not synonymous with the government. I mean, if you look at our systems that we have now with the digital HMRC, for example, to file your tax return, that was meant to be a whole load of convenience, and you end up on the phone for endless amounts of time on hold for a million years trying to get through to a human because it doesn't work. And as Felicity was saying, imagine if your access to any of these services was cut off. Do we honestly trust the Home Office and the appeals system and the courts to actually sort it out? So in terms of convenience, it's all well and good thinking, yes, in an ideal world. But the reality is that our government, and more broadly our society, is just not set up for this kind of thing to work.
Is it at risk from hacking as well, Jamie?
Yes, I think that there's a kind of fear that having all of this data in one place, a bit like with the NHS data, we talked about it on a recent podcast about how all of our NHS data is accessible by Palantir, who are quite a shadowy AI company. Because they've got a deal with the government, and that includes quite a lot of identifiable stuff about your health and all of that stuff, and that's kind of fairly underreported. So I would say again that we're in a situation where we're quite happy for our data to be with a lot of different people dotted around the globe, but maybe unhappy about it being in the government. My other kind of feeling about this, I know we talked about it in 2017, and I can't remember if I was pro or against it before in a previous episode of this.
You were very against.
That doesn't surprise me because I feel quite similarly now. But what I would say is that there's a lot of defeatism about this country and about this country's abilities coming from both Felicity and Harriet about the system that we live in, and I'm not 100% sure what the answer is then, because we do need to change what the Home Office, the setup is. We need to change the way that this government works. But if you strongly believe that there's no point and that actually this whole country is doomed to failure, then I mean I don't think we stand very much chance when the Russian tanks come rolling in, do we?
It's not defeatist, Jamie. It's pointing out criticisms and potential pitfalls. We're not just going to blithely be like, this sounds great, let's go for it.
I think it can be a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think that is fair.
Also, I mean, that initial list you gave of like, oh, it's just a list of gov.uk links, who wants to look at this slightly cynical, weary tone? In favour of gov.uk, you would have to say, wouldn't you, that it's better than what we had before. They have successfully digitised lots of government departments and made life easier. It can send me an alert when my MOT is due.
There are
That's better.
There are 191 ways to set up accounts and access services on gov.uk, and 44 sign-in methods. So I guess that it would actually be really good to simplify that through one. Yeah, that is an insane level of bureaucracy, even through gov.uk.
There's an app for that, or there will be soon. On the way, snap, that's the sound of injuries littering the world of football after this. Harriet, you are finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is women's football on its knees?
You might be able to hear a little bit of clapping from some of the hotel staff here at the Wales team base just outside Lippesville in Switzerland. We're right in the north of the country. But as you can see as well from this little waterfall, it gives you some sense of the entire hotel has been decked out in all the paraphernalia for Wales.
Who claps like that? Geraint Hughes reporting from Switzerland for Sky Sports on Sunday. Harriet, what's the story?
Well, the story is that this week the Women's Euros tournament is kicking off. So we've got England's opening game against Wales on Sunday, and that's the sound of the Wales team arriving in their hotel in
Switzerland.
The underwhelming
sound of the Wales team arriving. Oh, look, there's a water fountain.
It's a very nice water fountain.
Yes, sure.
But the story is that the Wales squad has been hammered by all of these knee injuries to their anterior cruciate ligament, which is the ACL, which is very similar to what happened to the England squad before the World Cup in 2023, which became known as the curse of the Lionesses. So their goalkeeper is out, a defender's out, and midfielder Megan Wynne, who's sort of been tipped as kind of a rising star, have all been ruled out of the tournament. And Megan Wynne ruptured her ACL in the final game of the season in April. It's actually her second ACL injury. The first came in 2020. And Sophie Ingle, who's the former Wales captain and kind of a queen of women's football, has just announced that she's fit to return, and she hasn't played for more than a year after her ACL surgery. So I thought we could use this as a way to talk about the prevalence of ACL injuries among female footballers and why that's massively on the rise.
Okay, Jamie, just how prevalent are these ACL injuries amongst female footballers?
Yeah, pretty prevalent. Studies suggest women are up to 6 times more likely to suffer ACL injuries than men in similar sports. Quite dozens of the elite female players have, including Beth Mead, Vivian Miedema, Sam Kerr and Leah Williamson, have all suffered ACL injuries in the past 2 seasons. I imagine you're going to ask why, Ollie.
I am.
That's the next question. And I mean, the causes are fairly complex. The truth is that there's not been enough research done, unsurprisingly, on women's bodies and women's health to know exactly why it is. I mean, some of the issue is ascribed to training regimes. Some of it is down to the equipment, obviously. A bit, actually, like we were talking about the army. All of the football equipment kit that they use was obviously designed for men and not necessarily designed for women. There was actually a really interesting study looking into whether period cycles and levels of estrogen in women could affect joint stability and whether or not that was the case. But these are all things that are only being looked at now after like this a huge amount of issues with it. Literally, we're talking about in the last year that these studies are taking place.
But hold on, Felicity. Women's football is this massive growth sport, right? So when Jamie says all of the kit they're using was designed for men, that doesn't feel instinctively true to me. It feels like, surely, you know, if you're Reebok or Adidas or something, in the last 10 years, you've been pouring money into developing things specifically for women. It's this huge area they want to boost.
I was also really surprised by that. A lot of the chat seems to be about female footballers' shoes, that they're just basically like men's shoes but smaller, whereas runners, they have, you know, female runners have shoes that are for their feet, and I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that the big sports giants hadn't done more, especially with, as you were saying, with the rise of the sport. But I think the rise of the sport is part of the problem in a way, because there's more pressure and more demand on these sportswomen. So they're having to train harder, they're having to do more matches, and this creates more of a pressure on their bodies. It's also to do with the surfaces that they play on, and a lot of the times they haven't had enough strength training in to begin with, as they sort of come up the ranks to strengthen their ACL in the first place. But it's worth saying, I mean, I think there's like so many reasons why this is going to be a problem, and obviously it's worth pointing out the obvious one, that the female body is very different to the male body. So things like the pelvis is wider, there's less muscle mass around women's knees, women have less testosterone, which is a key hormone for increasing muscle density, and they also have more estrogen than men, which is essential to bone growth. And that's why periods are also a big deal, because estrogen fluctuates during a woman's menstrual cycle, so that can also affect. But it's all these things that we're sort of only just catching up with now, and it's not just sport, obviously, and also it's not just women's football. There's other sports like basketball, I think volleyball, anyone where you have to like zigzag and pivot is really, really bad for your knees. But it's a kind of classic case of we still don't really fully understand women's bodies, basically.
But it's interesting though, because there are all of these biological components, obviously. There was a 2021 study in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, though, that showed that prevention tactics based on biological differences between men and women didn't actually decrease the disparity of injuries between the two sexes. So most people are now concluding that the bigger contributing factor to the rising massive prevalence of ACL injuries among female sports players are environmental issues. So gendered environmental issues. So particularly the fact that there aren't really structured pathways from kind of amateur young children and adolescents up to the adult elite, as in the same way that there are training pathways from the very young among male athletes and footballers in particular.
So that's things like missing out on physio.
Yeah, so less monitoring overall throughout the years, fewer qualified coaches, less investment in physio, fewer staff. There are just fewer staff with women's teams as well. They just don't have the resources for medical monitoring.
On that though, because one of the sort of major national women's teams that have had an issue around this and have been part of a study is Arsenal, right? Arsenal women.
Yes.
I know because they actually, as it happens, have their practice training ground around the corner from me, that they are very well resourced for a women's team and very well
for a women's team.
Yeah, but then like, is how much money is enough money if
you think
Arsenal
about,
can't do it?
But you've just said yourself, they're very well resourced for a women's team. Compare the resources allocated for the men's team, it's a drop in the ocean. They're also generally, the female teams are not permitted to play at the men's stadiums, regardless of how well resourced they are. Chelsea women, for example, one of the best teams there are, they do not play at Stamford Bridge, generally speaking. So the men's pitches are better quality. Women are much more likely to be playing on frozen or boggy ground. So there's all sorts of issues in which, no matter how well resourced and well funded that women's teams are comparatively, there's still absolutely not even close to being comparable to the men's resources and men's teams.
But I suppose, in a positive take on this, Jamie, that might get sort of ironed out as the growth in women's sport comes up from grassroots. I was at my son's sports day this week at primary school, and one of the observations lots of people were kind of quietly making in the crowd was the girls seem to be better at the football task than the boys these days. When you're looking at 5 and 6 year olds, they're a bit taller and they're a bit more analytical, and the boys just didn't have the patience to get the ball in the back of the net. So you kind of think, well, if that barrier's been smashed down in terms of access, then by the time those girls are 17, naturally we won't be having this conversation anymore.
Well, they said the same thing when I was 7.
And are you a professional footballer, Harriet?
Could have been. Could have. Shoulda, woulda, coulda.
Okay. I think it's, I mean, I'm speaking as a father of a girl. I have been spending quite a lot of time trying to throw a ball at her. I mean, she's only 8 months old, so it's difficult for her to really respond in the way that I think that's abuse. Hope. But no, I mean, it's a soft ball, right. And to be honest, you know, she's more interested in other things. But I'm still training. We've got a bespoke training schedule, but I do. What's interesting is before I had a child, I spoke to a lot of my female friends about the one thing that they would say about tips about being a girl, because obviously I'm not a girl, so how would I ever know what it's like to be a girl? And they all said that they wish that they'd continue doing sports over the age of 10 or 11, and that was the thing to push onto my child. And I think that's really telling, is that actually, yes, I agree that hopefully this will be beneficial in the long run, but it's a long thing, right? What you want to do is give teenage girls the opportunity and the space to develop sports skills or continue on with sports. And if there's a fear that they might get an ACL injury, that's going to put some people off. And I think the more that we can do sooner to change those parameters, potentially, the better.
Well, who's we, though, Felicity, in this instance? You know, the more we can do. Where's the money going to come from? Who's investing in this? What should be done?
It's a good question, but I mean the clubs themselves and the money just needs to be used better. There needs to be more medical trials and more research done. Otherwise, it made me slightly think of the CTE scandal in American football and then rugby, which was don't ask me what it stands for, chronic traumatic something, but it was basically that they realised that repeated blows to the head would give you this awful brain disease, and there's been all sorts of cases in this country, in the US, over it. And there was a very good film, was it Will Smith, called Concussion, which part of the problem was that financial motives were stopping people from investigating this cause. And so I sort of feel like it's not completely the same thing as ACL injuries, but if there isn't a proper duty of care, and if sports bodies don't take this seriously, that is, and there is, a sort of known link between the kit that these women have, or the ways they haven't been properly trained for it, then I think you could see a similar sort of thing emerging. I mean, it seems like a bit of an epidemic that's coming out of the shadows, but I do think they need to get on top of it pretty quickly. But going back to my earlier point, women's bodies are different, unfortunately.
Although in women's football, I think it's worth saying that one of the issues is that the vast majority of injuries, so I think nearly 90% of injuries in women's football are non-contact injuries. So in terms of the duty of care, it's actually very difficult to approach it in that way. In terms of the governing bodies, though, so actually in April this year, FIFA announced that it would be funding a year-long study, which started in June in a university in London, into whether hormonal fluctuations around your menstrual cycle could be contributing to the rise in ACL injuries. Because we know from previous research that female sports players are 6 times more likely to be injured in the days leading up to their period, which, as a person that goes to the gym 3 or 4 times a week, I can say absolutely for sure, the days leading up to a period, your body functions completely differently. Your strength completely goes, your balance completely goes. It's an extraordinary change. And separately, the Professional Footballers Association with Nike and FIFA Pro have launched a separate 3-year study into ACL injury prevention to focus on all the environmental factors that we discussed, like the facilities, the equipment, the staff. And there's been quite a good success, actually, with ACL injury prevention programs in hockey, in women's field hockey in Australia. It was very successful. There were 0 ACL injuries after this study that was implemented in 2019, which was really interesting. But just to go back to what Jamie was saying about thinking about when I stopped doing sport as a teenager and why. So I went to an all-girls school, and it was extraordinary how fast when we started getting our periods, and particularly when breasts start growing, and it's incredibly painful. I mean, it really is. Like, Felicity, you would agree with me here that is a very incredibly painful process, particularly when you're doing sport. And your body's changing constantly, and you don't have the resources to invest in sports bras. Sports bras aren't part of your traditional sports kit, for example. So that's the big problem, is that you'd have to get a new sports bra every 3 to 6 to 8 months. They're very expensive. It's £40 minimum for a kind of standard one. So there's all these factors that when the female body starts changing, you're dealing with pain and weakness around periods, and the pain of growing breasts, and also the societal expectation that comes in as a teenager where you should look a certain way. And that's a really big thing that's cited in all of these studies, is that when women are teenagers, it's not considered to be desirable to look very strong, to look physically fit, to work out. Even though resistance training is on the rise among women, it's still not necessarily what teenage girls want to look like. It's very strong and muscly. There's a lot of negative associations around that. You'd have a lot of accusations from guys at that age of being like unfeminine or unsexy. So there's just such a massive barrier as a teenage girl to continuing with sport. And I think there's so much that still needs to be done on that front.
That's really interesting because, I mean, subsidising sports bras, that feels like a quite straightforward thing, actually, if it's just a question
and yet it's never happened. You talk about, you're saying things like, oh, well, hopefully now that women's sport is starting to this, and then hopefully this. Actually, we said all that at the last World Cup. We said all that at the World Cup before that. I've been hearing that same argument about women's sports for 10 years in journalism, and still here we are.
Well, actually, just lastly on that, because, this is a big story, the Euros, not necessarily these injuries to the players. Is it real? Because that's the thing, because I'm not a football fan, so I can't tell whether this supposed excitement that the women's game is matching the men's game is really there in the general public or not. Will you be watching this tournament like you would the men's one?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, because I specifically remember with the World Cup in 2023, I was so keen to watch all of the matches in pubs. You would not believe how few pubs actually said that they were showing the games, actually had any way of booking it. Like, in terms of the excitement and the investment and the kind of hyping that goes on with the men's World Cup and the men's Euros, it just isn't there. It just isn't the same. But I do think it depends how far England goes, because obviously there was huge excitement when England won the Euros. They're obviously the reigning champions, and they got very, very close with the World Cup. Now, obviously, Spain are reigning champions there. So, like every sport in the UK and in England in particular, I think it totally depends how far England actually goes.
And also, actually worth saying, Jamie, you're in Scotland. Is there any excitement to watch England or Wales, indeed, up there?
No, not at all. I think that if you would even mention that England were playing, could you put it on the TV, you'd be laughed out of any establishment here.
That's quite a good outcome compared to how you can be treated in some pubs I've been to in Glasgow. My thanks to Jamie, Harriet and Felicity for your contributions to this week's show. You can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you find your podcast, then tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with the trial subscription if you go to theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to Unwrap next week, bye-bye.